I woke up in that sterile hospital room with the anesthesia still fogging my brain, the taste of metal on my tongue, and the beeping of monitors drilling into my skull. The nurse checking my IV line smiled like it was just another Tuesday, and said my children had already begun the transfer process for the nursing home placement and asset management while I was under the knife. She said it so casually, like she was announcing dinner options. My own blood had sold me out for cash. 68 years of grinding, 16-hour shifts building a precision machining company from a single lathe in a rented garage to a 7-figure operation with contracts across 3 states. And this was how they repaid me? Derek and Vanessa hadn't waited for me to die. They'd decided I was already gone the moment I hit the OR table for emergency gallbladder surgery. While I was unconscious, they'd activated that power of attorney I'd stupidly signed 6 months earlier during what they called a family estate planning chat. They'd convinced the hospital social worker I showed early signs of cognitive decline, then moved $1.87 million from my primary brokerage and operating accounts into a brand new LLC they controlled. They'd even executed a deed transfer on the lake house I'd paid off in 2019, the one with the workshop where I restored vintage engines on weekends. Total attempted theft, $3.4 million in under 11 days. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling the full weight of the betrayal sink into my bones like ice water. These were the same kids I'd put through college without student loans. The same ones I'd bailed out when Derek's real estate flip went belly up in 2018, and when Vanessa's wellness brand needed another $80,000 infusion. I had been their walking ATM for decades, and now they were trying to pull the plug while I was still breathing. The doctor came in later that afternoon, clipboard in hand, explaining the discharge papers. But the discharge wasn't to my home. It was to Sunnybrook Assisted Living, the facility my children had already toured and prepaid the first 3 months for with my own money. I could smell the stale institutional air just thinking about it, the same scent that clung to my late life's clothes after her final hospital stay. No, not happening. I signed nothing. Instead, I waited until the night nurse made her rounds, then I pulled the IV myself, dressed in the clothes I'd been admitted in, and walked out of that hospital at 2:17 a.m. with nothing but my wallet, my phone, and the original trust documents I'd kept in a safe deposit box they didn't know existed. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, but it cleared the last of the anesthesia fog. By the time I reached my truck in the parking garage, the rage had crystallized into something sharper, something colder. I didn't call them. I didn't scream or cry. I drove straight to a different bank branch 30 miles away, the one where I maintained my irrevocable trusts set up back in 2017, after a supplier tried to screw me on a contract. The branch manager recognized me immediately. I laid out the chain of events, showed him the original trust agreements that explicitly prohibited any power of attorney from touching those accounts, and watched his face tighten as he pulled up the transaction logs. Unauthorized wires, forged signatures. The LLC they'd created was already trying to siphon another $420,000 that morning. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in my attorney's office downtown, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the leather of old case files. Margaret Klein had handled my business litigation for 23 years. She listened without interrupting, then slid a legal pad across the desk and started listing the moves. We would file an immediate revocation of the fraudulent power of attorney. We would petition the court for an emergency order vacating any temporary guardianship they'd tried to secure. And we would hire the forensic accountant I'd kept on retainer since that supplier lawsuit, someone who could trace every dollar with timestamps and digital footprints they thought they'd erased. I spent the rest of that day in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, the kind with the buzzing neon sign outside and yellowed receipts from previous guests still in the drawer. I reviewed every bank statement I'd backed up to an encrypted cloud drive they never knew about. I watched the security footage from my home's Ring cameras that I'd set to notify only my phone. There they were, Derek and Vanessa, in my living room the night after my surgery, drinking my 25-year-old scotch, laughing as they divided up furniture like it was already theirs. Vanessa running her hand over the marble countertop she planned to rip out for something more modern. Derek on the phone with a broker discussing liquidation timelines for the company I'd built with calloused hands. I didn't feel sadness anymore. The pain had burned away, leaving only precision. They had handed me the perfect reason to become their worst nightmare. I spent the next 48 hours building the case in silence, downloaded every email, captured every text thread they'd been stupid enough to send through family group chat. By the time the sun rose on the third day, I had a manila folder thick with evidence and a plan that would strip them of everything they thought they'd stolen. They wanted me gone. They wanted my life liquidated and divided. They were about to learn exactly how thorough I could be when I stopped protecting them. I didn't sleep that night in the motel. I sat at the wobbly table under the humming lamp, the manila folder growing thicker with every screenshot and time-stamped transaction I pulled from the cloud. By dawn, I had a complete audit trail. $1.87 million wired out in 3 separate transfers between 11:47 a.m. and 4:12 p.m. on the day of my surgery. Another $312,000 moved from the company operating account the following morning. The deed transfer on the lake house, recorded at 3:09 p.m. that same afternoon, filed by a title company that clearly hadn't asked for proper ID verification. I drank black coffee from a styrofoam cup and felt nothing but clarity. No rage tears, no shaky hands, just the mechanical satisfaction of a machinist measuring tolerances before cutting metal that would never forgive a mistake. At 8:30 a.m., I drove to the second bank, the one holding my irrevocable trusts. The manager, a woman named Carla who'd known me since I opened the first account in 2004, met me in a private office. I laid the original trust documents on her desk, the ones that explicitly stated any power of attorney required my personal wet ink signature in her presence, and that the trusts were protected from exactly this kind of financial abuse. Her eyes widened as she read the transaction logs I'd printed. "These are fraudulent," she said quietly. "We can freeze everything tied to that power of attorney immediately and reverse the wires that haven't cleared yet." I nodded. "Do it, and prepare affidavits. I want every single transfer flagged for elder financial exploitation." By 10:15 a.m., the first dominoes were falling. 2 of the larger wires, $940,000 total, were clawed back into my protected accounts. The LLC my children had created was now locked out. I watched Carla type the notifications with the same cold focus I once used to calibrate CNC machines. Precision mattered. 1 decimal point off and the whole piece was scrap. From there, I drove straight to Margaret Klein's office again. She had already pulled the temporary guardianship petition my kids had rushed through an emergency ex parte hearing while I was still in recovery. The judge who signed it had been given a doctored medical summary, claiming I exhibited acute confusion and inability to manage affairs. Margaret slid the paperwork across the desk, her face granite. "We're filing an emergency motion to vacate this order today. I've also contacted Dr. Harlan, the neurologist you saw last year for that minor TIA. He's willing to provide an immediate competency evaluation stating you're fully capable. We'll have it by tomorrow morning." I signed where she pointed, the pen scratching across the paper like a blade on steel. Then I handed over the Ring camera footage. Derek and Vanessa celebrating in my living room. Vanessa already measuring the kitchen for new cabinets she planned to expense to my estate. Derek on speakerphone telling the broker he could close the company sale in 45 days if they moved fast. Margaret's smile was thin and sharp. "This is textbook financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. We're adding that charge to the civil complaint. The district attorney's office will get a copy by close of business tomorrow." I left her office at 1:47 p.m. and drove to the forensic accountant's place on the industrial side of town. Richard Voss had helped me crush that supplier lawsuit years ago. His office smelled of printer toner and strong coffee. He reviewed everything I brought, then leaned back in his chair. "Give me 72 hours, and I'll have a report that reads like a criminal indictment. Bank stamps, IP addresses on the forged documents, Even the metadata showing the power of attorney PDF was altered after you signed the original. They got sloppy. I paid his retainer on the spot, $15,000 wired from one of the protected trusts. Money well spent. Every dollar they tried to steal would now cost them 10 in legal fees and judgments. The silent recon continued through the afternoon. I checked into a different extended stay hotel under my attorney's advice, paid cash for the first week. I activated a new phone with a new number only Margaret and Richard knew. Then I remotely accessed my home security system and changed every access code. The Ring cameras kept recording. I watched my daughter pull up at 6:22 p.m. in her leased Mercedes, key fob still working because they hadn't realized I could revoke it remotely. She let herself in, arms full of paint swatches, and started taking photos like a realtor staging the place for sale. I saved every frame. Derek showed up an hour later with his wife and 2 bottles of my best bourbon. They toasted in my kitchen, talking about how they'd split the proceeds from the company sale. Vanessa mentioned putting me in the memory care wing at Sunnybrook so I wouldn't cause drama. Their laughter echoed through the speakers of my laptop in that sterile hotel room. I didn't flinch. I cataloged every word. By midnight, I had compiled a second folder. Timestamps, geofence data from the security system proving they entered my property without permission after I was hospitalized. Screenshots of texts where they coached each other on what to tell the hospital staff. The paper trail was becoming a noose, and they still thought they were at a victory party. I poured 2 fingers of cheap hotel bourbon into a plastic cup and raised it toward the screen. Not in celebration, in acknowledgement. They had spent years treating me like an expired asset. Now I was the machine they'd built, precise, unforgiving, and finally running at full power with no safety interlocks. The quiet phase was almost over. Soon the paperwork would speak, and it would speak in a language they understood perfectly. Total financial annihilation. The quiet counterbuild felt like calibrating a lathe in the dead of night. Every movement deliberate, every measurement double-checked. No room for vibration or error. I stayed in that extended stay hotel for the next 5 days. The kind with the faint smell of industrial carpet cleaner and the low hum of the mini fridge that never quite shut off. No one knew where I was. Not Derek, not Vanessa, not even the hospital staff who'd tried calling my old number. I paid cash for everything, used the new phone, and kept the blinds drawn while the red blinking light of my laptop screen reflected off the manila envelope stacked on the desk. Every night at precisely 8 p.m., I logged into the home security system and reviewed the Ring doorbell footage from the previous 24 hours. The cameras I'd installed myself, motion activated, 4K with night vision, caught everything in crystal detail. There was Derek pulling up in his leased SUV at 7:42 p.m. on the 3rd evening, carrying a case of my 25-year-old scotch like it was already his inheritance. He let himself in with the key fob he still thought worked, the security system beeping once in welcome before I remotely changed the code from my laptop. He never noticed. Inside, Vanessa was already there, her voice carrying through the speaker as she called him the smartest brother in the world for moving so fast on the LLC paperwork. They toasted in my kitchen, glasses clinking against the marble island I'd paid $18,400 to install back in 2021. They talked about how the company sale would net them each at least $1.2 million after broker fees, how they'd finally be able to afford that vacation property in the mountains they'd always wanted. Vanessa mentioned redoing the lake house master bath with a walk-in steam shower, using my money, of course, while Derek laughed about putting me in the locked memory care wing so I wouldn't wander off and embarrass them at family gatherings. I saved every clip. I time-stamped every frame. The forensic accountant, Richard Voss, had given me a secure upload portal, and I fed him the footage along with the geofence data showing their phones inside my property for hours after I was hospitalized. He replied within minutes. Metadata confirmed the power of attorney PDF had been edited on Vanessa's laptop at 10:14 a.m. the day before my surgery. IP addresses traced back to their home Wi-Fi. Bank transfer authorizations showed forged signatures that didn't even match the muscle memory of my own handwriting. I printed everything in the hotel business center at 2 a.m., the machine spitting out page after page with that warm toner smell that reminded me of late nights in my old shop office. Yellowed receipts from my personal files, every college tuition payment, every bailout check I'd written them over the years, lay spread across the bed like evidence in a trial. $312,000 to Derek for his failed real estate flip. $80,000 to Vanessa for her collapsing wellness line. Another $47,000 when her husband's gambling debt surfaced in 2022. I had never asked for a dime back. I had been their safety net, their walking ATM, and they had decided the net needed to be cut while I was still breathing. Margaret Klein called me on the secure line at 9:15 a.m. the following morning. Her voice was steady, professional, the way it always got when a case was airtight. She had the emergency motion to vacate the guardianship ready for filing. Dr. Harlan's competency evaluation had come back crystal clear. Fully oriented, no cognitive impairment, capable of managing all affairs. She read me the key paragraphs over the phone while I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the crinkle of fresh legal paper in my hands. We were also preparing the civil complaint for financial exploitation of an elder, felony charges possible, full asset freeze requested, and a demand for immediate return of every transferred dollar, plus treble damages under state law. I didn't interrupt her. I just listened and felt the machinery inside me lock into place. No anger flares, no second guessing, just the cold satisfaction of watching the tolerances tighten. That same afternoon, I drove to Richard's office again, the industrial park bathed in gray afternoon light. He slid the preliminary forensic report across the conference table. 63 pages of bank stamps, wire confirmations, and digital footprints. The LLC they'd created was listed as the new beneficiary on 3 of my largest accounts. The deed transfer on the lake house had been notarized by a mobile service they found on Craigslist, the notary's stamp already flagged as questionable in a prior elder abuse case. Richard tapped the page with a pen. These transfers are reversible. The list pendants we'll file on the house and company will cloud the title so hard no buyer will touch them for months. By the time we're done, their little celebration footage will be Exhibit A in open court. I signed the engagement letter for the full audit, another $22,000 from the protected trust, and left with 3 flash drives containing the master file. Back in the hotel, I spent the evening cross-referencing everything against my original trust documents. The irrevocable trusts from 2017 were ironclad. They explicitly voided any power of attorney not executed in the presence of 2 witnesses and the bank officer. My children had never bothered to check. They assumed the quiet provider who never raised his voice would simply roll over and die. The final piece clicked into place at 11:47 p.m. on the 5th night. I sat in the dark hotel room, the only light coming from the laptop screen, and watched the latest ring footage in real time. Derek and Vanessa were in the living room again, this time with their spouses, spreading out color swatches and talking about listing the machining company with an auction house. Vanessa's husband joked about how I'd never noticed the missing funds once I was comfortably medicated at Sunnybrook. Their laughter filled the speakers, sharp and entitled, the same tone they'd used when asking for money all those years. I paused the video. I exported the clip. I uploaded it to the secure portal. Then I closed the laptop, poured the last of the cheap bourbon into a plastic cup, and stared at the blank wall. The betrayal still burned, but it had been forged into something useful now, something precise and merciless. They had spent days drinking my scotch and dividing my life like it was already scrap metal. I had spent those same days building the machine that would crush them under the weight of their own paperwork. The quiet phase was complete. Every wire, every signature, every arrogant toast had been cataloged and dated. Tomorrow the motions would hit the courthouse clerk's office at 8:30 a.m. sharp. Bank accounts would freeze, titles would cloud, and my children would wake up to the first real consequence of treating their father like an expired asset. They had given me the perfect reason to become their worst nightmare. And the nightmare was just waking up. The first domino fell at 8:47 a.m. the next morning, and it fell with the quiet finality of a judge's stamp on a fresh motion packet. Margaret Klein and I walked into the county courthouse together, the marble floors echoing under our shoes, the faint smell of lemon polish and old paper files hanging in the air like a held breath. She carried the thick binder herself, 63 pages of forensic accountant's report, Ring camera stills printed in color, bank affidavits, Dr. Harlan's competency evaluation, and the original irrevocable trust documents from 2017. I carried nothing but a single manila envelope containing the new phone number and the cash for filing fees. We didn't speak in the hallway. There was no need. The machinery was already in motion. The clerk accepted the emergency motion packet without comment, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she scanned the cover sheet. Immediate revocation of fraudulent power of attorney, petition to vacate temporary guardianship order, civil complaint for financial exploitation of a vulnerable, adult under state elder protection statutes, and 2 separate lis pendens filings, one on the lake house deed and one on the machining company's corporate real estate holdings. The judge on duty that morning was the same one who had signed the ex parte guardianship order 4 days earlier. Margaret had requested an immediate review on grounds of newly discovered fraud. By 9:22 a.m., the clerk handed us certified copies with the judge's signature still wet on the page. Every account tied to the fraudulent power of attorney was frozen pending hearing. The lis pendens hit the county recorder's office electronically at 9:41 a.m., clouding title on both the $1.15 million lake house and the $2.8 million company property so hard that no title company in 3 states would touch them. I felt the shift in the air the moment we stepped back outside into the parking lot. My phone, new number, new carrier, began vibrating in my pocket. Not calls from Derek or Vanessa yet, those would come later. First, it was the banks. 3 separate notifications within 11 minutes. The primary brokerage account holding $940,000 had been locked. The operating account for the machining company rejected an outgoing wire of $285,000 that Derek had tried to push through at 9:03 a.m. The LLC they created was now flagged for suspected elder financial exploitation, and every pending transaction was on hold. I drove back to the extended stay hotel in silence, the certified copies of the court orders resting on the passenger seat like loaded magazines. The red blinking light on my laptop greeted me when I opened the hotel room door. I logged into the home security system and settled into the chair by the window, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. At 10:17 a.m., the Ring doorbell camera caught Derek's SUV screeching into the driveway of the lake house. He slammed the door so hard the camera shook. Vanessa's Mercedes pulled in 30 seconds behind him. They both still had working key fobs because I hadn't cut the codes yet. I wanted them inside when the panic hit. The security system beeped once as they entered, then fell silent. I turned up the audio feed. Inside my living room, they were already arguing. Derek's voice carried clear through the speakers, tight with disbelief, telling Vanessa the bank had just rejected the wire for the company broker's retainer. She was pacing in front of the marble island, phone pressed to her ear, demanding to speak to a supervisor. I watched her face change color on the 4K feed as the bank rep explained that all accounts linked to the power of attorney were now subject to a court-ordered freeze. She hung up and threw the phone onto the couch. The forensic report hadn't even been served yet, and already the money spigot was welded shut. I sipped the last of the hotel coffee and felt nothing but the cold, machined precision of a part fitting exactly where it belonged. No gloating, no rage, just the satisfaction of tolerances locked. At 11:04 a.m., my old phone, still forwarding to the new one, lit up with the first voicemail. Derek's voice, no longer smooth and entitled, cracking as he left a message asking where the hell I was and why the banks were saying the accounts were frozen. Vanessa called 30 seconds later, her tone shifting from confusion to accusation in under 10 words, claiming this had to be some kind of bank error and that I needed to fix it immediately because we're trying to protect your assets. I saved both voicemails. Richard Voss would add them to the master file before lunch. By 12:30 p.m., the list pendants had already triggered alerts at the title company they'd used for the fraudulent deed transfer. Margaret texted me the confirmation. The lake house could not be listed, sold, or refinanced until the civil case was resolved. The machining company's corporate veil was now pierced by the court order. Any attempt to liquidate would be treated as conversion of assets. I watched on the Ring feed as Derek stood in my workshop, staring at the vintage engine I'd been restoring, running his hands through his hair like a man watching his future evaporate. Vanessa was on her laptop at the kitchen table, frantically refreshing bank portals that now showed every account locked with the same red banner. Court ordered hold. Contact legal department. They still didn't know I was watching. They still thought I was drooling in a nursing home bed somewhere. I let them stew for another 90 minutes. Then, at 2:12 p.m., I remotely changed every security code in the house. The system beeped loudly on the feed. 3 long tones that meant access denied. Derek tried his key fob again. Nothing. Vanessa's face appeared on the doorbell camera, mascara already smudged, pounding on the front door and screaming my name like the neighbors weren't already peering through their curtains. I didn't answer. I simply exported the new footage, uploaded it to the secure portal, and closed the laptop. The first domino had fallen, and the chain reaction was already picking up speed. Bank wires rejected, titles clouded, phones ringing with automated freeze notifications. My children were learning in real time that the quiet provider they had tried to bury was now the one holding the legal sledgehammer. They had spent years treating me like an asset to be liquidated. Now the paperwork was liquidating them. And this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The takedown happened in courtroom 4B on a Thursday morning, exactly 9 days after I walked out of that hospital. And it unfolded with the same mechanical inevitability as a CNC machine finishing its final pass. I arrived at 8:40 a.m., wearing the same navy sport coat I'd worn to every important contract signing for 30 years. Margaret Klein walked beside me, carrying the master binder, now swollen to 87 pages, with the full forensic accountant's report bound in red. Richard Voss had delivered it at 7 a.m. that morning. Every unauthorized wire, every forged signature, every metadata timestamp laid out in columns so clean they looked like the blueprints I used to approve in my shop. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table without a word. The courtroom smelled of fresh wax on the floors and the faint metallic tang of old radiator heat. Derek and Vanessa were served at the lake house at 7:15 a.m. by a sheriff's deputy who handed them the certified packets while the Ring doorbell recorded the entire exchange in 4K. I watched the footage live from the courthouse hallway. Derek's face going slack as he read the first line of the summons. Vanessa's hands shaking so badly she dropped her phone on the front steps. They showed up at 8:55 a.m. anyway, still dressed like they were coming to a probate hearing they expected to win. Derek in his usual sales manager polo, Vanessa in the same designer jacket she'd worn while measuring my kitchen for renovations. Their spouses trailed behind them like nervous flying monkeys, eyes darting everywhere except at me. They sat at the respondents' table directly across the aisle. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. The judge entered at 9:02 a.m., a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s named Ellen Hargrove, who had already read the emergency filings. She opened the session by confirming the temporary guardianship order had been vacated at 8:30 a.m. on the basis of Dr. Harlan's competency evaluation. Then she turned to the main event. She asked my attorney to present the civil complaint for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Margaret stood, voice steady and clinical, and walked the court through the timeline. She started with the power of attorney I had signed 6 months earlier under false pretenses during what my children had called a casual estate planning meeting. She moved to the hospital social worker's notes that had been manipulated while I was under anesthesia. Then, she placed the forensic report on the bench and invited the judge to review it line by line. Judge Hargrove adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint crinkle of paper as she turned each page. She read the first unauthorized wire. $940,000, moved at 11:47 a.m. on the day of my surgery, from my primary brokerage into the children's new LLC. She read the second. $312,000 from the company operating account the next morning. She read the deed transfer executed on the lake house at 3:09 p.m., notarized by a mobile service that had been flagged in 2 prior elder abuse investigations. She read the metadata showing the power of attorney PDF had been altered on Vanessa's laptop at 10:14 a.m., the day before my operation. She read the IP addresses tracing every forged document back to the family Wi-Fi at Derek's house. She read the Ring camera timestamps proving both children had entered my property without permission while I was hospitalized, and had spent hours drinking my 25-year scotch and planning the liquidation of the machining company I had built with my own hands. Every sentence landed like a hammer on steel. I watched them without turning my head. Derek's face had gone the color of old paper. Vanessa's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. At one point, the judge paused on Exhibit 47, the still frame of them toasting in my kitchen, while Vanessa described the exact steam shower she planned to install with my money, and asked if the respondents wished to respond. Their attorney, a slick corporate type they'd hired the day before, stood up and tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that they had only been trying to protect their father's assets during a medical emergency, that the transfers were made in good faith under the power of attorney. His voice sounded rehearsed and hollow in the quiet courtroom. Judge Hargrove cut him off before he finished the second sentence. She asked him to explain the forged signatures. She asked him to explain the metadata. She asked him why, if this was protection, his clients had listed my company for sale through a broker who had already received a $75,000 non-refundable retainer from the frozen LLC account. The attorney sat down. Then the judge turned to me and asked if I had anything to add before she ruled on the motions. I stood up slowly, the same way I used to stand up when a supplier tried to short me on a parts delivery. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I told the court I had spent 40 years building something real so my children would never have to struggle the way I had. I told her I had never asked for gratitude, only basic honesty. And I told her that when they decided I was worth more dead than alive, they had given me the only motivation I needed to protect what was mine. I sat down. Judge Hargrove didn't hesitate. She granted every motion on the record. The power of attorney was revoked permanently. The list pendants would remain in place until full restitution. She ordered the immediate return of all $3.4 million in transferred assets plus interest at the statutory rate. She referred the entire file to the district attorney for criminal investigation into elder financial exploitation. And she signed the restraining orders right there at the bench, 500 yards from me, from my home, from my company, from every account and every piece of property they had tried to steal. The gavel came down at 10:47 a.m. Derek and Vanessa sat frozen in their chairs, like someone had unplugged them. Vanessa's husband tried to put an arm around her, and she shook it off, eyes wide and glassy, staring at me as if seeing a stranger for the first time. Derek's mouth opened and closed twice, but no sound came out until the bailiff started walking toward their table to escort them out. That was the exact moment their smug masks cracked wide open. They had expected me to be medicated and confused in a nursing home bed. Instead, I was standing 10 feet away in a courtroom, watching them lose everything by the cold, precise machinery of the law they had tried to weaponize against me. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The satisfaction was deeper than that, machined, permanent, and completely unforgiving. As the bailiff led them toward the double doors, Vanessa turned once and looked straight at me. Her voice carried across the courtroom in a broken whisper that everyone heard. She called me heartless for doing this to my own children. I met her eyes without blinking and answered in the same flat tone I used when rejecting a bad parts shipment. I told her they had stopped being my children the moment they forged my name while I was unconscious on an operating table. Then I turned my back, picked up the single manila envelope from the table, and walked out with Margaret into the bright morning light. The takedown was complete. The real recovery was about to begin. The asset recovery began the same afternoon the gavel came down, and it moved with the relentless precision of a well-maintained hydraulic press. Slow, unstoppable, and crushing anything in its path. I drove straight from the courthouse to Margaret Klein's office, the certified copies of the restraining orders and the full judgment still warm from the clerk's stamp resting on the passenger seat. The judge had given us everything. Immediate possession of the lake house restored to me, the machining company's corporate records returned under my sole control, and a court-ordered accounting of every dollar they had touched. Margaret had already coordinated with the sheriff's civil division. By 2:30 p.m., a deputy was en route to the lake house with 2 separate packets: a formal eviction notice giving Derek, Vanessa, and their spouses exactly 30 days to vacate the property they had never legally owned, and a writ of possession authorizing me to change every lock the moment the 30 days expired. I didn't go to the house myself. I didn't need to. I parked at the extended stay hotel one last time, opened my laptop, and watched the Ring doorbell camera in real time. The deputy arrived at 3:12 p.m. The red light on the camera blinked steadily as he knocked. Derek answered the door, still wearing the same polo from court, his face the color of old concrete. Vanessa stood behind him, arms crossed so tight her knuckles were white. The deputy handed them the manila envelopes without ceremony, read the eviction notice aloud in that flat, official tone sheriffs use when they've done this 1,000 times, and told them the property was now under my exclusive control per court order. Any attempt to remove items not listed on the original inventory would be treated as theft. He handed them a copy of the restraining order too, 500 yards from me, from the house, from the company, from every bank account still frozen. Vanessa's voice cracked as she started arguing with the deputy, calling it harassment, claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that they were only trying to protect their father. The deputy didn't blink. He simply pointed to the paperwork and reminded them that violating the restraining order would result in immediate arrest. Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser, the camera catching the way Derek's shoulders slumped as he stared at the thick packet in his hands. I watched them close the door. I watched them stand in my living room, and open the envelopes. I watched Vanessa sink onto the couch and start crying, while Derek paced in front of the marble island they had already started measuring for new countertops. The smell of fresh paint I had noticed in earlier footage was still there. They had begun redecorating the guest bath with samples they'd bought using the LLC card before the freeze hit. Their phones started exploding with notifications within minutes. The bank sent automated texts confirming the full asset freeze and demanding they appear for an accounting hearing in 14 days. The title company emailed both of them, confirming the lis pendens made any sale or refinance impossible. Richard Voss's office sent the preliminary restitution demand. $3.4 million returned in full, plus $214,000 in interest and attorney fees, due within 30 days, or face asset liquidation of anything they still owned in their own names. I let the footage run. I cataloged every second of their collapse. The voicemail started at 4:07 p.m. My new phone forwarded them automatically. Derek's first message was shaky, almost pleading, saying they never meant for it to go this far, that they were just trying to secure the family's future, that I had to call him so they could work this out like adults. Vanessa's came 30 seconds later, her voice thick with tears, telling me I was destroying the family over a simple paperwork error, and that if I didn't drop the charges, she would never speak to me again. I saved both. I saved the next 12 that came in over the following 3 hours, each one more desperate than the last, shifting from apology to accusation to outright begging. One of them even offered to pay me back in installments if I would just lift the freeze on the LLC. I didn't reply to a single one. That night, at 11:43 p.m., the Ring camera caught them trying to come back anyway. Derek's SUV pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the dark. Vanessa was in the passenger seat, makeup streaked, clutching a manila folder of what looked like their own bank statements. They walked up to the front door and knocked. The security system beeped the new warning tone I had set after the court order. Derek tried his old key fob. Nothing. He pounded on the door and called my name loud enough for the neighbor's lights to start flicking on. Vanessa stood behind him, voice carrying clearly through the camera microphone, saying they just wanted 5 minutes to explain that this was all a big mistake, that blood was thicker than paperwork. The restraining order made it simple. I had already forwarded the live feed to Margaret's on-call service. Within 12 minutes, a sheriff's patrol car rolled up, lights flashing but siren off. The deputy stepped out, recognized the situation immediately, and informed them they were in violation of a valid court-ordered restraining order. Derek tried to argue. The deputy simply handcuffed him on the spot. Vanessa started screaming that this was insane, that I was the monster here. But the deputy read them both their rights and placed her in the back of the second cruiser that arrived as backup. The cameras caught the entire arrest in high definition. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the lake house windows they had planned to replace with something more modern. I watched from the hotel bed as they were driven away. No satisfaction in the drama of it. Just the cold, machined certainty that boundaries now existed in steel and paper and court stamps. The next morning, the eviction process accelerated. The sheriff's civil unit delivered the formal 30-day notice to their attorney and posted it on the front door. I drove out to the lake house myself at 10 a.m., accompanied by Margaret and 2 armed security contractors I had hired the night before. The house was empty. They had left in a hurry after the arrest, paint swatches still scattered on the kitchen counter, half-empty boxes of their belongings in the guest room, the faint smell of stale perfume from Vanessa's cardigan draped over a chair. I walked through every room, the crinkle of the eviction notice in my hand, and felt the weight of 40 years of my own labor settle back into the walls. I changed every lock myself. I updated the security codes. I called the company that handled my machining operations and instructed them to resume normal business under my direct control. No interim managers, no auctions, no more talk of liquidation. The forensic accountants team began the full asset trace that afternoon, preparing the paperwork for civil judgments against both Derek and Vanessa personally. By evening, the desperate voicemails had turned into blocked numbers and frantic texts from unknown contacts. Flying monkeys they had recruited from distant cousins and old friends, begging me to show mercy. I forwarded every single one to Margaret for the permanent no-contact file. They had redecorated my house while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. They had planned my disappearance like a business transaction. Now the sheriff's notices were taped to their former front door, the restraining orders were active in every law enforcement database in the county, and their names were about to be attached to public judgments that would follow them for the rest of their financial lives. The recovery was on my terms. Every dollar, every title, every square foot of property they had tried to steal was being clawed back with the cold efficiency of the law they had once believed would protect them. They had given me the perfect reason to become their worst nightmare. And the nightmare was now in full control of the assets they had thought were already theirs. The final boundary slammed shut on a crisp October morning, exactly 43 days after the gavel had come down in courtroom 4B. And it closed with the soft, final click of a deadbolt I installed myself. I stood on the front porch of the lake house, the same porch where I used to watch the sun rise over the water after 16-hour shifts, and turned the new key in the last lock. The security system beeped once in confirmation, the red light on the Ring doorbell glowing steady and mine alone. Inside, every trace of their redecorating had been stripped away. The paint swatches were gone. The half-empty bourbon bottles they'd left behind had been boxed up and donated to the Veterans Hall downtown. The marble island still stood exactly as I had paid for it, but now it held only my morning coffee and the manila envelope containing the final court judgments. The civil case had wrapped in a single hearing 2 weeks earlier. Richard Voss's full forensic audit, 127 pages of bank stamps, wire confirmations, and digital footprints, had been entered as the sole evidence. The judge ordered full restitution of the $3.4 million plus $287,000 in statutory interest, attorney fees, and punitive damages. Derek and Vanessa were jointly and severally liable. Their LLC had been dissolved by court order. The deed transfer was voided. Lis pendens lifted only after the titles reverted to me. The district attorney had accepted the referral for criminal elder financial exploitation. Both faced possible felony charges, though their attorneys were already negotiating pleas that would include permanent no-contact orders and full asset forfeiture if they defaulted on the judgment. I didn't attend the final hearing. Margaret Klein handled it and texted me the outcome at 11:12 a.m. Judgments entered, restraining orders extended indefinitely, and their names now permanently attached to public records that would follow them through every credit check, every loan application, every background screening for the rest of their lives. No inheritance, no beneficiary status on any trust. I had updated every irrevocable trust that same afternoon, removing them as contingent beneficiaries and naming instead 3 scholarship funds for kids who actually worked for what they received. The machining company was back under my sole control, contracts renewed, employees told simply that family matters have been resolved. They tried one last time anyway. The voicemails had stopped after the arrests, but the flying monkeys kept coming. Distant cousins, old neighbors, even Vanessa's former wellness followers, sending texts and emails begging me to reconsider, to show mercy, to remember blood was thicker than paperwork. I forwarded every single one to Margaret for the permanent harassment file. Then, 3 nights ago, Derek showed up at the end of the driveway at 1:47 a.m., standing just outside the 500-yard restraining order line, phone flashlight cutting through the dark. He called my new number from a blocked ID, voice raw, saying he had lost his job because the judgment had frozen his personal accounts, that Vanessa's husband had left her when the credit cards maxed out, that they were both facing foreclosure on their own homes because the banks now viewed them as high risk after the elder exploitation flags. He begged me to lift just enough of the freeze to let them breathe, swore they had learned their lesson, promised it would never happen again. I let the security system record every word. I didn't pick up. I simply stood at the window in the dark, watching the red blinking light on the doorbell camera capture his silhouette shrinking back into the night. The machine I had built, the one they tried to scrap while I was unconscious, had no reverse gear. Yesterday, the sheriff's civil unit delivered the final writs. The 30-day eviction clock had expired. Any property they left behind was now legally abandoned and subject to my disposal. I walked through the house one last time at dawn, the faint smell of fresh paint long gone, replaced by the clean scent of the lake breeze coming through the open windows. I changed the last access code on the security system, updated the beneficiary forms at the bank with Carla watching in silence, and signed the final trust amendments in Margaret's office at 10 a.m. sharp. No tears, no second thoughts. Just the machined satisfaction of tolerances finally locked into place. I drove away from the lake house at 11:30 a.m., the new keys in my pocket, the workshop tools already loaded into the truck bed for the short move to a smaller cabin I had purchased cash 2 weeks earlier. Nothing flashy, just a quiet workshop on 10 acres where no one knew my name or my story. The old life they tried to liquidate was now mine again, smaller, cleaner, and completely under my control. The company would run fine without me hovering. I had promoted the shop foreman to operations manager with a stake that rewarded loyalty instead of blood. The trusts would fund scholarships for kids who actually showed up to work. And I would spend my mornings restoring engines, and my evenings watching the water, without wondering who was measuring my kitchen for resale. They had given me the perfect reason to become their worst nightmare. I became it, and then I walked away. The final image I carried wasn't their tears in court or their desperate voicemails. It was the moment I closed the front door of the lake house for the last time, turned the deadbolt, and felt the faint smirk pull at the corner of my mouth. The same small, cold expression I used to wear when a bad supplier realized the contract they thought they could break had just cost them their entire business. I didn't need to say goodbye. I didn't need to explain. The paperwork had done the talking, and it had spoken in the only language they ever truly understood: total, irreversible loss. I pulled onto the county road, the lake shrinking in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 68 years, I felt the full weight lift. No more walking ATM. No more safety net for people who only reached for it with knives. Just the quiet rhythm I had always wanted. Coffee on a new porch, engines in the shop, and the absolute certainty that the boundaries I had drawn in steel and quartz stamps would hold forever. They had tried to bury me while I was still breathing. Instead, they had handed me the shovel, the blueprints, and the perfect reason to build something they could never touch again. And I built it.